It was a Thursday at the end of spring, one of those days when the air still smells like melting snow, but the sun breaks through the clouds as if urging the flowers to bloom. I spent the morning cleaning the porch and rearranging the cushions on the swing, humming to myself and thinking about the roast I planned to cook the next day when James returned. He had been away on a business trip to Red Gulch for 3 weeks, fixing old factory equipment that no one else could understand. I missed him. I missed the way he always smelled of gasoline and pine, as if he had been fighting the forest before coming home. My knees hurt, but I moved as if someone was trying to outrun time. I turned 68 this month. 68, and I still wake up at dawn to gather eggs, fetch water, and whisper to the rows of beans and tomatoes as if they were my grandchildren. We lived in Grey Rock, a mountain village carved out of solid rock and pine trees. There were no more than 900 souls here, if that. Most were like me, worn out and quiet. That morning the house was sparkling. I opened the windows to let in the cool air. The scent of lemon polish mingled with the sharp smell of pine trees. The table was wiped down and I counted the cash left after I had cut down my shopping list. The bills lay under my glasses, next to the jar of barley I used to hold the bills down. That was a mistake. As I soon discovered, it was one of many. Around 2 p.m., I slowly made my way to the store, pulling a shopping cart behind me. I picked up potatoes, thyme, 2 onions, and a bottle of cooking wine that James liked to sneak a drink of when he thought I wasn't looking. I stopped to chat with Mavis at the counter. She's half blind but still sharp as a tack when it comes to village gossip. When I returned, the screen door creaked too loudly and the house was too quiet. I don't know what exactly alarmed me. Maybe it was the way the curtains fluttered, a little too much like a breath. Maybe it was just the absence of that envelope. I checked the table. The money was gone. It wasn't lost, it hadn't blown away in the wind. It was gone. I stood motionless, the bag of potatoes hanging from my wrist like a weight. My first thought wasn't suspicion. It was shame. Had I become so forgetful? But no. I remembered clearly where I had left the money. I remembered thinking, I'll put it in the tin when I get back. I looked out the kitchen window and saw them. Evan and Marcus, the boys from next door, were running down the path through the blackberry bushes. Evan was holding something crumpled in his hand. Something white. My envelope was white. I didn't run after them. I stood there holding onto the table and felt my heart beating strangely slowly. It wasn't anger, not yet. Just sadness, that old pain that lives in your bones when you've been too kind to the wrong people. These boys were always hanging around. Always hungry, always looking for something to do. I gave them cookies, coins, errands, praise. Last winter, I sewed a button on Evan's coat when his mother was too tired to do it. And now this. When the sun sank below the ridge, casting long shadows across the fields like fingers, I sat down at the table, poured myself some wine, and waited. Not for James. Not for justice. For clarity. Because that's what happens when something small breaks. It doesn't stay small. It grows legs. It walks through the doors of memory, pulling at all the old threads you thought were securely sewn together. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I baked an apple pie. Not because I wanted to. Because that's what I do when I'm trying to keep my hands from trembling. There's something about peeling apples, about the ribbon of skin falling in one long, coiled strip, that makes you feel like you still have control over something, even if it's just fruit. The kitchen filled with cinnamon and butter, and for a moment, I could almost pretend things were normal. But the silence had a sharpness to it now. Every creak in the floorboards made me look up. Every breeze through the open window felt like a whisper. By noon, I couldn't take it. I walked next door, my hands dusted in flour, and knocked on the Hadley's screen door. Their mother, Sharon, answered, squinting at me like the sun was in her eyes instead of shame. "Margaret," she said, smoothing her apron, "everything all right?" I didn't answer that. I asked instead, "Are the boys home?" She hesitated. Just a flicker. Then nodded. "They're in the back. Playing." I stepped onto the porch, not waiting to be invited in. I walked past the sagging couch and the faint smell of old grease and something sour until I reached the back door. Evan and Marcus were digging in the dirt, chasing a frog, laughing like boys who hadn't taken something that wasn't theirs. "Evan," I called. He froze. Turned slowly. His face was red. A flush of guilt, perhaps, or just the heat. But I saw it plain as day. The panic. The kind that only shows up when you're young enough to still feel sorry. "Did you take something from my kitchen yesterday?" Marcus's head shot up. Evan looked at the ground. "No, ma'am," he said too quickly. I sighed. Deep and slow. The kind of sigh that pulls from the belly. "Lying will cost you more than stealing ever will, Evan. Remember that." He opened his mouth, closed it again. Marcus whispered, "We didn't mean to." I turned then. Not waiting for more. Not needing to hear it. I'd planted the seed. Shame does better work than scolding ever could. That night there was a knock on my door. Soft. Uneven. I opened it to find Evan standing there, eyes downcast, holding the envelope. The bills inside were bent, a little damp. He held it out like it burned. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. I didn't say anything. I took it from him, nodded, and shut the door. I leaned against it for a long time, the envelope clutched to my chest. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about what it meant to still believe in decency, even when it shows up small and trembling on your doorstep. I put the envelope in the tin. Then I cut a slice of that pie, poured a second thimble of wine, and sat by the window. Because sometimes justice is just a boy with flushed cheeks and the courage to knock. James came home the next morning just as the sun broke over the ridge, his truck kicking up a cloud of dust like a dog shaking off river water. I watched from the porch, still in my nightgown and shawl, one hand curled around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. There was a tightness in my chest, not worry exactly, but the kind of ache that comes when you've been holding a story too long. He carried in his bag, kissed my cheek, and said, "Smells like you've been baking." He noticed everything. And nothing. That was always James's gift. I told him about the envelope, the boys, the knock at the door. He listened in that quiet way of his, nodding, his eyes distant. I told him only half the money had been returned, what remained was crumpled and damp. The rest, gone. Spent, most likely, before guilt could catch up with them. Poor parenting, he said finally. Sharon's never had much hold over those boys. I wanted him to ask how I felt. I wanted him to say something about betrayal. Instead, he moved on to asking if the rooster still pecked at his boots and whether the upstairs sink was still dripping. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house in bare feet, touching objects as though trying to reassure myself that they still belonged to me. I paused by the bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album, the one from 1978 with the cracked leather spine. There was a picture of me, 21, standing in front of the old blue barn with a newborn in my arms and wild hair down to my waist. I looked happy. Tired but happy. There was another of my mother, a stiff portrait, her lips pursed as if she was still scolding the photographer. The next photo stopped me. It was of my daughter, Nora, standing beside a Christmas tree in a dress she'd once begged for, her eyes wide and unwilling to smile. It had been 3 years since I'd seen her in person. For since she'd called me by any name other than Margaret. She was living in Boulder now, with her partner, Janine, a nurse, quiet and kind. They had a dog and a life that didn't include me. At least, not anymore. I'd sent gifts, birthday cards, even a quilt I spent the winter sewing. No reply. Not a single thank you. James never said much about it. He said Nora was always independent. I said she was angry. He shrugged. Let her be, he'd said once. She'll come around. But some daughters don't. Some daughters take your heart and never write back. The next day, I found myself writing a letter I didn't plan to send, just to see the words. Nora, I'm not sure if this will find you or if you even care to read it. I don't know where I went wrong, and maybe that's the hardest part. Was it the time I missed your recital? The time I called Janine by the wrong name? Or was it just the way I folded too much into my silences, hoping you read them like a book? I miss you. Even now, I miss you. Mom. I folded the letter. Left it on the windowsill. It wasn't for her, not really. It was for the part of me that still remembered what her hair smelled like after a bath. That afternoon, while James napped, I walked to the post office. There was a new girl behind the counter, maybe 20. She smiled with her whole face and asked, "Anything going out today?" I paused, then handed her a small parcel addressed to Nora. Inside was the letter, the photo album, and a folded note that simply said, "Your mother is still here." I didn't expect a reply, but for the first time in a long while, I felt the tightness ease. That night, the wind picked up. The kind that speaks through the cracks in the windows and makes the house feel alive. I curled into bed beside James and thought about silence, not as something hollow, but as something waiting to be broken. James spent most of that week fixing the upstairs plumbing, whistling through his teeth, the way he always did when he didn't want to talk. He'd ask me to hold a wrench or fetch a bucket, and I'd do it silently because what was there left to say? We'd grown so used to our quiet it had become furniture, always there, always unacknowledged. On Thursday, I decided to bake again. Rhubarb this time. James liked it sharp, almost mouth-puckering, the way his mother used to make it. As I was folding sugar into the bright red chunks, the phone rang. It was Nora. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the hesitation in her voice the moment I picked up. "Hi. It's me." For a moment, I thought I might cry. But I didn't. I held the receiver like a fragile bird, unsure if it would fly away at the first loud sound. Nora, I said, my voice paper thin. I got the package. I waited. She didn't speak. The silence stretched like a rubber band. Then, you still make rhubarb pie? I smiled just a little. It's in the oven. We talked for 12 minutes. About nothing and everything. Her work, the dog, how Janine wanted to plant lavender in the yard. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. But just before she hung up, she said, I read the letter. All of it. Good, I said. And that was enough. Afterward, I stood in the kitchen and let the pie burn. The smell filled the house like something sacred. James came down and waved the smoke away, muttering about windows, but I didn't care. The smoke smelled like hope. 2 days later, Evan was back. Not at my door this time, but standing by the edge of the garden, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I saw him from the window and went out, wiping my hands on my apron. What is it, Evan? He looked at his shoes, then back at me. My mom said you won't ask for the money. I nodded. That's true. He shuffled his feet. She said you forgave us. I bent down, looked him in the eyes. I forgave what could be forgiven. The rest isn't for me to carry. It's for you. He didn't understand, not yet. But maybe one day he would. He nodded solemnly and left a small plastic bag on the porch steps before running off. Inside was a crumpled $5 bill and 3 wrapped peppermints. That evening, James sat beside me on the porch, rubbing the sore spot in his shoulder. The sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in streaks of copper and pink. Nora called, I said quietly. He looked over, surprised. Really? Ma'am. He said nothing for a while. Then, that's good. We sat a long time without speaking. Just 2 people stitched together by time and silence, watching the evening unfold like a familiar story. The kind you've read 100 times, but still find comfort in its pages. As night settled, I thought about all the things we don't say. About how love doesn't always come with speeches or grand gestures. Sometimes it's just returning half an envelope, making a phone call, or leaving peppermints on a step. And sometimes it's just sitting quietly beside someone while the sky darkens. The letter from Nora sat on the hallway table for 3 days before I opened it. Not out of fear exactly. More like reverence. I'd forgotten what her handwriting looked like, rounded, slanted slightly right, the way it used to trail across the birthday cards she made as a child. When I finally opened it, I sat at the kitchen table with my glasses halfway down my nose and the letter trembling in my hands. Dear Mom, I don't know what made you send the package, but I'm glad you did. I've read your letter twice now. The picture of me by the Christmas tree? I remember that day. I remember the smell of oranges and the way you braided my hair so tight it made my eyes water. I'm sorry it's taken me this long. I've been angry, but I think I've been mostly sad. I guess I just didn't know how to come back. Love, Nora. There was no mention of Janine. No invitation. But there was love. Love, Nora. I folded the letter and slipped it behind the sugar canister where I kept small things too meaningful to leave out in the open. The next day, the phone rang again. This time it was Janine. Margaret? Hi, it's Janine. I know it's a little odd, but Nora's thinking about visiting. She's nervous. I thought maybe I'd check with you first. I stood there, the phone warm against my cheek, stunned silent. Then I said, she's always welcome. Always. The visit was set for Sunday. I cleaned the house like royalty was coming back, polished every surface, replaced the dish rags, even dug out the little embroidered hand towels my mother made. James watched me bustle about and finally said, she's not coming to inspect you, you know. I know, I said. But I didn't stop. When Sunday came, the morning was cool and gray, the kind of sky that hangs low like a hell breath. I wore my good blouse, the one with the tiny violets, and put on lipstick for the first time in months. Their car pulled in just before noon. I saw Nora through the windshield, her hair longer than I remembered. She stepped out slowly like the ground might give way beneath her. Janine stayed in the car. Hi, Mom, Nora said. I opened my arms, not wide but just enough. She hesitated, then stepped in. She smelled like lavender in winter. We spent the afternoon drinking tea and pretending to be strangers who remembered each other. She asked about the chickens. I asked about her dog. And then finally we got to it. You always gave more than you should have, she said, stirring her tea. And I never said thank you the way I should have. I reached across the table, touched her hand. You're saying it now. She cried then, quietly like she was ashamed of it. I let her. I passed her a napkin and said nothing else. When they left, the sky had turned dusky purple. James stood behind me at the window, one hand on my shoulder. Think she'll come back? He asked. I don't know, I said. But she came today. That's more than I expected. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed up rereading her letter and tracing the loop of her name at the bottom with my finger like it was a signature on my heart. There are stories that end with fireworks. And then there are stories like mine. The kind that end with a quiet knock on the door. The day after Nora's visit, I felt drawn to the attic. I couldn't explain why. I just felt compelled, as if someone were whispering to me, "Go and sort out the past." James was in the shed, replacing the belt on the lawnmower. I climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking as if it remembered too much. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. Sunlight filtered through the cracks, and everything seemed suspended, as if the air was made of memories. Under an old blanket, next to the chest with my wedding dress, lay a box. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were things that didn't belong to any particular period of my life, but were still important. My father's pocket knife, a dried rose from my mother's funeral, a faded postcard from San Diego. But my attention was drawn to a photograph in an envelope. It was labeled in James's handwriting, "Margaret, don't throw away." I slowly opened the envelope. Photographs fell out. They were of us 25 years ago, standing in front of the house with Nora between us with pigtails and chubby cheeks. One photograph, however, was different from the rest. It was James with a little boy. Not Nora. The boy, about 5 or 6 years old, was standing next to James at an old gas station, both of them covered in grease. I turned the photo over. On the back, in James's neat handwriting, was written, "Tommy, summer 1994. I stared at it. My heart was beating slowly in my chest. I didn't know any Tommy. I had never seen this child before. That evening at dinner, I waited for the roast to be carved and the corn to be buttered. "James, who is Tommy?" He stopped chewing. He blinked. He put down his fork. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found a photo. In the attic. It's you and a little boy." His face hardly changed, but his hands did, his fingers clenching the napkin until it turned white. He was someone I helped in the 90s. His mother worked nearby. He wasn't home much. I waited. "Margaret," he said slowly. "He wasn't mine. Not in that sense. But I cared about him. Maybe more than I realized." I looked at him. I had been with this man for almost 50 years and there were things I had never heard. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked at me with his blue eyes. There was never a right time. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say, really. That night, after James went to bed, I sat on the porch with the photograph. The boy looked happy. Safe. I wondered where he was now, what kind of man he had become. It's strange to miss someone you never knew. But I did. Not because of what I had lost. Because of what had been hidden. The next morning, I put the photo back in the box and returned it to the attic. Some ghosts are better left upstairs, wrapped in old blankets. But I also wrote a name on the card, Tommy, and I tucked it into the back of my recipe book, because someday someone might need it. A week after the attic, I got a letter in the mail, not from Nora, but from a name I hadn't seen since before she was born. Millie Garrity. In careful cursive, the return address read Blue Hollow Correctional Facility. I sat down at the kitchen table before opening it, my heart thudding in that old, a rhythmic pattern it had whenever the past came calling. Inside was a single page. No pleasantries. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means I've got not much left but the truth. You might remember Tommy. He was mine, but not for long. I gave him to the system when he was 7. I couldn't keep up. Couldn't stay clean. James took care of him better than I ever could. That man saved him in ways I didn't understand then. If you know where he is, tell him I'm sorry. And thank James. He was better than I deserved. Millie." I read the letter 3 times. James hadn't lied, not exactly. But there was more to Tommy than I realized. Not just a boy from the gas station. A boy left behind. That night, James found me in the den with the letter in my lap. "You knew she went to prison?" He nodded slowly. "After she left, Tommy, yeah. Heard about it from the owner of the station. And you never looked for the boy?" He looked tired then. "Older. I did for a while. Called around. But the system doesn't give much to people who aren't blood. And I figured, maybe it wasn't my place." We sat in silence for a long time. I thought about the envelope for Millie, about Tommy's name on the back of that photo. How many other names had been lost to time because no one bothered to write them down? I made a decision. The next morning, I went to the library, the one in Cold Springs with the creaky floors and the kind-eyed librarian who always wore mismatched earrings. I told her I was looking for someone. Gave her the name, the birth year, the little I knew. 3 hours later, I had a lead. A man named Thomas Garrity ran a mechanic's garage in New Havenshire, 3 towns over. I called. A woman answered. Garrity's garage. I'm looking for Thomas. This is his wife. Who's calling? I hesitated. Then, an old friend of his mother. There was a pause. Hold on. When he came to the phone, his voice was deep. Calm. This is Tom. You won't know me, I said, but I knew you once. When you were small. My husband, James, he looked after you for a time. Silence. Is he still alive? Yes. Tell him I remember. I always remembered. That was all. But it was enough. When I hung up, I stared at the phone like it might dissolve. And maybe it did a little. Dissolve the years, the mystery, the regret. That night, I told James. We sat by the fireplace with mugs of cider and I said, he remembers you. And he's all right. James didn't cry, but his hand trembled slightly as he set the mug down. Sometimes closure doesn't come in grand reunions or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it's a phone call. A name rediscovered. A thread pulled gently from the edge of a fraying memory. And sometimes it's just enough to know you were not forgotten. 2 weeks after James and I heard from Tommy, the days took on a strange calm. It was like the house had finally exhaled after decades of holding its breath. We sat on the porch more often, watched the robins gather twigs for their nests, and found ourselves speaking in murmurs as though not to startle the peace. Then came the knock. It was a Tuesday just before dusk, when the sky bleeds into lavender and all the shadows grow long. I opened the door to see Sharon Hadley, the boy's mother, standing there with a Tupperware of banana bread and a look that said this wasn't just a neighborly drop-by. Can I come in? She asked. I nodded and stepped aside. She placed the bread on the counter, her hands fiddling with the hem of her shirt. I wanted to say thank you for not raising a fuss. About the boys. About the money. I poured her some iced tea, mostly out of habit. I'm not here to make excuses, she said. But I've been struggling. More than I let on. Lost my job at the diner 3 months ago. My sister's been sick and it's just a lot. I didn't interrupt. Just sipped my tea and waited. Evan's been working odd jobs. Marcus too. And they talk about you, you know. About how kind you are. She paused, looked up at me. I'm trying to raise good boys. But I can't do it alone. And I was wondering. She hesitated. Then would you consider tutoring them? Just an hour or 2 a week. They're both falling behind in school and I can't afford a proper tutor. But you were a teacher. I set down my glass. Looked at her. Not with pity but with the weariness of a woman who's carried too many people for too long. It's not the boys' fault, I said. They're just learning from the scraps they're given. She nodded, her eyes glossy. So you'll help. I sighed, then smiled, just a little. They'll need paper. And no more stealing. She laughed then, the sound cracking open something inside her. Deal. That night, James found me in the study pulling out my old geography maps and lesson plans. You're not going back to work, are you? He teased. Not work, I said. Just continuity. The next afternoon, the boys came by with notebooks and hopeful eyes. Evan had even combed his hair. Marcus held out a pencil like it was a peace offering. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, the same table where James and I had eaten, argued, planned, and mourned. I taught them about elevation and rivers. We practiced handwriting. I made them each read aloud. Afterward, Marcus lingered. Miss Margaret, he said shyly, how do you know all this stuff? I looked at him and smiled. Because I've lived long enough to forget half of it, and still remember what matters. He didn't understand, but he grinned like he'd just passed a secret test. Later, as they walked home, I sat by the window and watched them disappear into the dusk. I didn't feel tired. I felt restored. Because sometimes healing doesn't come through the people you raised, but through the ones who arrive afterward, broken, hopeful, and needing exactly what you still have left to give. 3 weeks passed like a song with a soft ending, the kind that fades rather than stops. Evan and Marcus came every Tuesday and Thursday, their voices growing louder, their posture straighter. Evan had started helping an older farmer mend fences. Marcus brought me a dandelion chain once, proud as a king. Then one morning a letter came from Nora. Not an envelope but a package. Inside was a framed photo, her and Janine in their garden, holding up squash like trophies. There was a note tucked behind it. Thought you might want to see where I've been planting things. Love, N. I hung it by the window across from the sink so it could watch me do the dishes. That same afternoon, I wandered to the far edge of our property, past the rusting tractor and the patch of lilies that had outlived every flower bed. There, beneath the great willow, was the bench James had built for me the summer Nora turned 10. The plaque on it had faded, for M. May your thoughts always find shade. I sat there, knees wrapped in a quilt, and let my mind drift. Lately I'd been thinking more about the future than the past. Not because the past didn't matter, but because the past had finally let go of my throat. James joined me after a while, carrying 2 mugs of cider and a tin of ginger cookies. You always bring food like we're about to have a summit, I teased. He shrugged. If the world ends, I'll be full. We sat without speaking. Just watched the breeze tug at the branches. After a while he said, "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we'd had more kids?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But then I remember how tired I was with one." He chuckled. "Fair." I turned to him. "You did good by Tommy, you know, even if you didn't get to finish the job." His mouth tightened, but he nodded. "I hope he knows." "He does." He said so. The bench creaked beneath us as we leaned back. I didn't know what would come next. More visits from Nora? A surprise call from Tommy? Or maybe just more quiet Tuesdays with Marcus struggling over fractions. But I wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. Because the unknown wasn't emptiness. It was potential. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the future might be something I was still part of. The wind whispered through the willow leaves, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it needed to be. Spring came late that year. The snow didn't melt so much as disappear, like a secret too heavy to hold. One morning, the ground simply opened up to daffodils and damp earth. I took it as a sign. Nora called again. Her voice was less hesitant, more rooted. "We were thinking of coming for Easter," she said. "If that's okay." "Of course it's okay," I said. And I meant it. I cleaned the guest room. Not because it was dusty, but because I wanted it to feel like welcome. I found the old quilt Nora used to love, the one with the purple stitching, and laid it at the foot of the bed. James hung a wind chime out front. It was made of old keys and spoons, and it sang a different tune every time the wind came down from the ridge. They arrived Saturday afternoon. Janine drove. Nora brought tulips. She handed them to me like an offering. Her eyes sang all the things words never quite managed. We hugged. Not stiffly, not cautiously, just hugged. We spent the evening in the kitchen, elbows bumping as we cooked. Janine made lamb stew. Nora rolled out pie dough. I just watched them for a while, my heart full in that aching, dangerous way that makes you afraid to blink. After dinner, we played cards and drank cider until the candles burned low. It was quiet, and it was perfect. The next morning, I found Nora sitting alone by the willow. "You used to read to me out here," she said, patting the bench. I sat beside her. "You always wanted the same story. The one about the girl who talked to birds. Because you made the birds sound different every time." We laughed. Then she turned serious. "I don't know how to say this, but I want you in my life. Really in it. Not just postcards and polite calls." I took her hand. "Then let's stop pretending we don't know how." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I think we already did." That evening, after they left, James and I sat by the chime. It rang low and sweet like a bell far away. "That was a good visit," he said. "It was the kind of visit that plants roots," I replied. And as the sun dipped low, I noticed the tulips had started to open. About a week after Easter, I received a card in the mail. Not from Nora this time. It was addressed in blocky, awkward letters, and inside was a child's drawing stick figures under a tree labeled "Me" and "Ms. Margaret." It was from Marcus. There was a single line in his careful scrawl, "Thank you for making me feel smart." I cried. Not the loud, heaving kind. Just the slow, warm leaking of the soul. Because I knew what it meant for a boy like him to feel seen. Later that day, I walked through the house and noticed things I hadn't in years. The paint peeling by the stairs, the hairline crack near the ceiling, the sun-bleached photo of Nora from her high school graduation. Time had settled in quietly like dust behind books. I pulled out a pad and began to list repairs. Not because I thought the house would collapse, but because I was no longer waiting for things to fall apart. I was choosing to tend. Choosing to stay. James helped where he could, though his hands had grown stiffer. We patched the porch steps, recaulked the windows. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the front door that had chirped like a cricket for nearly a decade. "I guess even crickets retire," he said, grinning. One morning, I caught myself humming. Not the melody of habit, but something lighter. I didn't even realize I was doing it until I looked up and saw my reflection in the glass. I was smiling. Not for anyone. Just for myself. Nora called again the following Sunday. "We've been talking," she said. "Janine and I. We want to host Thanksgiving this year. We want you and Dad to come. We want to cook the whole thing." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I said, "As long as I can bring the pie. Only if it's the one with the braided crust." I laughed. "Is there any other kind?" After we hung up, I sat on the porch with my tea and watched a squirrel race along the fence. I thought of how fragile things had once felt. How close everything had come to unraveling. And how somehow here we were, still upright, still trying, still stitched together. That evening, I framed Marcus's drawing and hung it near the back door where the light hit it just right in the afternoons. Some walls hold more than pictures. Some hold promises. And this house, papered in memory, was beginning to feel like home again. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, I woke early. Too early. The kind of waking that comes not from a sound but from memory whispering in your dreams. I padded downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in James's old flannel robe. The silence was a thick thing, comforting and full. I watched the sun rise through the east window, light spilling slowly over the kitchen floor like honey. I thought of all the mornings that had passed here, how many I'd spent hunched over grocery lists or school papers or cooling pies. This time, I just sat still. The phone rang at 7:02. It was Nora. "We've got the turkey," she said. Janine insisted on brining it herself. "Also bring your apple pie, but we're trying sweet potato this year too." "You're walking a fine line, darling," I teased. She laughed. That same bubbling laugh I remembered from when she used to chase butterflies barefoot in the yard. On Thanksgiving morning, James and I packed the car with casseroles and a tightly wrapped pie, the kind I only make when I really care who's eating it. The drive was quiet but not tense. Just the hush of two people carrying a history too full for words. Nora's house was bright with music and spice. Janine greeted us with flour on her cheek, her hands busy but warm. There were hugs, the kind that land with weight. Dinner was chaos in the best way. The dog barked. The baby, a friend's toddler, they were watching through mashed potatoes. Someone spilled cider. I watched it all from the corner of the couch, and for once I didn't feel like a guest in my own story. After dinner, Nora pulled me aside. "I found something," she said, leading me into the study. On the desk was a box. My old letters, ones I'd written and never sent, ones she'd kept. Notes from her childhood, scribbles and thank you cards in a paper I'd graded with a red star. "I kept them," she said, voice small. "Even when I was mad. I kept them because I didn't want to forget." I touched the corner of the box. "You didn't." Later that night, back at home, I laid in bed beside James, my fingers tangled with his. "You all right?" he asked. "More than all right," I said. Because sometimes the long road leads right back where it started. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the ones you love remember how to come home. Winter arrived early that year and not gently. By the first week of December, the tree stood bare as old truths, and the wind had that particular bite that cuts through scarves and speaks of years long gone. James took to wearing 2 pairs of socks in the house. I teased him. He teased me back by pretending not to hear. One Saturday morning, I found him sitting at the table with the classified section open, glasses perched on his nose, pen in hand. "You looking for a new wife?" I asked, pouring my coffee. "Nope," he said. "Thinking about selling the truck." I nearly dropped the mug. "That old Ford? The one you rebuilt with your brother in '89. He looked at me serious. "I haven't driven it in months. Figured someone else might need it more." I sat down slowly. "Are you feeling all right?" "Better than I've felt in a long while," he said. "I just don't need to keep holding on to things I'm not using." I understood what he meant, even if it wasn't about the truck. That afternoon, I went into the guest room and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were blankets I'd crocheted over decades, saved cards, boxes of buttons, and every photograph Nora ever mailed me. I sorted gently, lifting pieces of my life like relics. By evening, I'd filled 2 small boxes. One for Nora, one for Marcus and Evan. In them were small things, photos, books, a scarf, a tin of old marbles I knew Evan would treasure. The kind of things you pass down not for value but for meaning. The next day, I drove to the post office. The girl behind the counter, Callie, with the blue eyeliner and chip polish, helped me tape them shut. "Holiday gifts?" she asked. "Sort of," I said. "Things that matter." She nodded like she understood. When I returned home, James was in the yard, tossing breadcrumbs out for the crows. They came every year, like clockwork. He always said they remembered who fed them. I stood on the porch and watched him, my heart a mix of warmth and ache. It's a funny thing, getting older. You start realizing that memories live not in the grand events, but in the rituals. The mugs you always reach for. The chair that creaks. The crow that returns. That night the power flickered. We lit candles and ate soup by firelight. The silence between us wasn't silence at all, it was history breathing. And I thought, if this was what remained, this house, this man, this warmth, it would be enough. A few days after the new year, I was in the kitchen when I heard the mailbox clang. I shuffled outside, boots crunching against the frozen path, and opened the box expecting bills or a catalog. What I found was a small envelope, hand-addressed in tight, familiar script. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, old-school notebook style. The ink had smudged just slightly. The note read, "Thank you for being the place I could always come back to. I didn't know what I needed until I heard your voice again. I love you. Nora." I folded the note back the way it was. Creased and perfect. Like us. I didn't show James. Didn't frame it. I tucked it in the sugar canister right where I used to hide special things when Nora was small. A lock of baby hair. Her first crayon drawing. A half-melted chocolate coin. Some things are too sacred to display. They belong where sweetness lives. Later that afternoon, the boys, Marcus and Evan, came by, cheeks red from the cold. Evan held up a lumpy package. "We made you something." Inside was a wooden picture frame. The photo was of the three of us at the table a candid Nora had snapped one tutoring day. We looked like a strange little family. The frame was scratched, uneven. Perfect. I hugged them both. "You boys," I said, voice cracking, "you turned out better than you know." James came in from the barn then, shaking snow from his coat. He looked at us, me holding the frame, the boys beaming, and smiled like a man who'd finally found the last piece of a puzzle he thought was lost. That night, I sat by the fire, frame beside me, the folded note in my pocket. The wind howled outside, but the house stood warm. There are stories we tell and stories we live. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they become the same. I've spent most of my life giving my time, my patience, my quiet sacrifices. But in the end, what I got back wasn't just peace. It was proof that I mattered, that I shaped something, that I was loved. And for a woman like me, once overlooked, once mistaken for the help, that is the most beautiful ending there is.